idea that we're withdrawing from this is just a diplomatic nightmare.
Today we are bringing you a special edition of Thinking Cap to help provide you with some context and significance about the urgency of a particular moment that everyone in DC and actually around the world are discussing, and that is our withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement. So joining us is Christy Goldfuss. She is the former managing director of the White House Council on Environmental Quality under President Obama, and is now serving as the Vice President of Energy and Environmental Policy here at CAP. To break it down for us, thank you, Christy.
Thanks for having me, Michelle. And Igor, of course.
Oh, thank you. Finally, Christy, recognizing. I was going to say how lucky we are to work with you every day, but now I don't know. I don't know how lucky we really are. So, Christy, let's just start with a breakdown of what these accords were in 2015. I mean, I remember when news broke that over, 190 nations came together in this agreement. Why is this so significant?
Well, a little context. If you go back to another climate agreement that people talked about a lot, which was the Kyoto Protocol. That was an exercise that the United States did not join because the agreement was binding. The Senate, it was a treaty. The Senate would have to ratify and say, these are binding targets. Well, when that exercise fell apart, leaders in the climate space really tried to decide what can we do that will bring together the entire world to address this global challenge of climate change. And what they decided was the best thing to do was kind of lead by example and push people in kind of a transparent, competitive way. So what you have in the Paris Agreement is every nation in the world, except for Syria and Nicaragua, coming together and saying, here's my target. Here's what I think I can do in this global challenge. Here's how I think I can reduce my emissions. But it's non-binding. It's a target. It's a goal. It's sort of an aspiration. And the idea was that there would be transparency in seeing what each nation would do. And if you didn't reach your target, you'd be embarrassed, but there's no repercussion.
The kind of collective shame.
Correct. Collective shame. But unlike Kyoto Protocol, and the reason the Senate didn't have to ratify is this is non-binding. So the absurdity of the discussion that we're having here now with 195 nations coming together and saying that they're doing this, it's on their own terms. So the idea that we're withdrawing from this is just a diplomatic nightmare because everyone from those other countries are now going to look at us and say, you are abdicating your position of leadership for what? What were the consequences? What was the reason that this was so dramatic that you could no longer be in partnership in addressing these challenges, especially given the role the United States plays in polluting and putting out carbon dioxide into the air?
Now, for people who aren't familiar, what is the U.S. footprint when it comes to our pollution levels here, and where does that rank in terms of other countries around the world?
Because we are the largest historic polluter.
Yes, we are the largest historic polluter. Recently, one of the biggest changes that we've seen, it always was that our pollution levels would go up when our economic viability grew. In the past several years, we saw an incredible split where, as a nation, the United States has become economically stronger, but we've reduced our emissions by 10%. So we've been able to break that coupling of economic progress really being tied to emissions. And now
what happened over the last 8 years? I wonder. Maybe a specific administration, maybe?
But also the markets. I mean, we've seen, yes, policy drives this, but policy's not alone. I mean, we've really seen renewables. Solar has it has increased by 30 times over the past 8 years. So we've seen this incredible growth because there's now parity in cost across different types of energy. And that's really because people are demanding, we want solar, we want wind. The market is saying this is where we're going. Natural gas has really been a game changer here in the United States, which is less polluting than coal. So lots of different factors have come into play here, not just policy, but of course, the leadership of President Obama in really putting forward policies that made it so governors, mayors, utilities, all different types of power companies could see what they could do in terms of reducing their carbon emissions.
Now, when President Trump came in, he announced that he would undo the Clean Power Plan, which was the vehicle by which we were going to meet our goal under these accords. So I guess it goes to the question of, if we're already going to be eliminating the mechanism that we're using to limit our emissions, what does today's decision actually signify?
So there was a lot of discussion and I think, frankly, hope that what President Trump would decide is to stay at the table, but renegotiate our goals. So say basically, we're not doing the Clean Power Plan, we're not pushing on these other policies, and so we are going to put forward a different goal and even talk more about clean coal technology, which surprisingly, China is really the leader when it comes to clean coal technology. So we thought that was a possibility. And one of the reasons progressives in particular were really pushing for that is at least the United States would still be part of the conversation, still be at the table. The reason you see Exxon and Shell in the business community, more than 1,000 businesses have come out in support of staying in the agreement. They don't want to lose the seat at the table to be able to hear where the technology fights are going to be. That, from their perspective, is weakening our American competitiveness, because even Exxon wants to know, where should we be investing in research and development? Where is the growth going to be in the energy sector? And if we're not at the table when those discussions are happening, we have no ability to influence them. So, really what that means for us is if we leave, it's a diplomatic crisis. And what we saw post-Kyoto, and if you talk to any of the Bush administration officials, they were quite shocked at how problematic it was for them over their tenure that we really ceded our leadership in the climate change debate with regard to Kyoto. So you're not going to be gaining more jobs. You have businesses saying that this is going to hurt their competitiveness, and we will be standing alone with Syria in rejecting the Paris Agreement ambition. And what does that say to all of our partners? Coming out of this G7, we are standing alone.
Well, to touch on that point, I think many people may be aware that Chancellor Merkel made basically a stunning admission that Europe would have to move alone on many issues. And I think one of those issues was obviously around climate. But in terms of our leadership internationally on the issue of climate change, I recall when Inconvenient Truth came out and you saw Al Gore traveling around the world, and there was a sense of moral leadership that America was coming to the table. But this day feels like we have taken 50 steps backwards,
That's
not
right.
one or two.
Yeah. Inconvenient Truth 2 is actually coming out this summer. And really the tack they've taken with the film this time is to highlight the impacts of climate change that are happening right now. The difference between where we were when we were talking about this in the Kyoto context 20 plus years ago is that now it's pretty much undeniable. Yale University has incredible polling where every district in the United States, the majority of voters believe climate change is happening. Where we tend to start to disagree is whether or not it's going to impact your life today. And of course, if you live in Miami and you have sunny day flooding and you have to change your commuting routes because you can't get into your neighborhood because it floods in the middle of the day, you have a different opinion of whether or not it's impacting you now. Or communities like Ile-de-Jean-Charles or in Washington and Alaska, where we are paying to move them because the island will no longer exist in the case of Ile-de-Jean-Charles in the next 10 years or so. So the whole community.
Where is that?
In Louisiana. So the whole community that exists there is picking another location to live and choosing which plants they're going to bring with them and what is their description of home that they want to bring to their next space. The impacts of climate change are so real and tangible for such a large percentage of the United States right now that, yes, it feels so dark and feels really as if we're kind of sticking our head in the sand or just, plugging our ears and closing our eyes and going, na, 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 and not watching the changes in front of us.
Well, to that point, and just to drill down on the impacts of Trump's decision to withdraw from the agreement, do we expect the business community, the Apples, the Microsofts, the even
GE.
Exxons, GE, to continue investing in clean technologies? They, see it as a business advantage.
Right.
So what will, outside of the diplomatic crisis and us ceding our leadership in the world in this important issue, what are the real-world immediate consequences of this decision?
So the rosy part of the picture, if there is one, is really where we are in the markets and in terms of renewable energy development. It was said in Marrakesh at the Conference of the Parties decision about a year ago, where everybody comes together to talk about climate change. If the United States had made this decision 10 years ago and technology hadn't made this major leap, it would be disastrous. But because we are in the place where there are so many advancements and there really is sort of a race to the top, with China investing more and India having a really aggressive solar target, there is the potential that these companies will continue forward and that the markets will be strong enough and we will continue making progress in solar and wind that we may even come close-ish to meeting the targets that we had laid out. But that is hard because this administration is not only pulling us out of the agreements, but they are doing everything possible to stand in the way of the markets that could carry us there. So not just the policy decisions, but stand in the way of renewables, stand in the way of solar and wind, and promote an antiquated idea of coal. At the same time, you have coal companies saying they will never build a new coal facility in the United States. So, I mean, the ideological battle that Steve Bannon and Scott Pruitt have set up here is so striking that my hope is that there will be just an enormous backlash to this. And going forward in 2018 and 2020, politicians will have to answer that question. Do you stand with the future of our children? Do you stand with the communities that are suffering right now? Or do you stand with Trump, Mitch McConnell, and the 21 senators who have made this happen, who are really looking to the past polluters, antiquated idea of what this country is?
And that's key, because the process for withdrawal is a 4-year process.
That's right. Right. Again, it is a 4-year process. So even though they will have their press release, even though this will be incredibly damaging to us in that 4-year period of time on the international stage, it will not officially take place until 2021.
Christy, the thing that I want our listeners to know, though, is there is always something that we can do.
Yes.
Right? The thing that they can't take away is our voice. And you talked about the backlash. What would you say is something that our listeners could get involved in? Are there organizations? Mm-hmm. Are there marches? I mean, there's such a hunger right now for people to get involved. So what would you say that people can do?
First of all, very practically, anyone who lives in the Washington, D.C. area, there will be a protest tomorrow at the White House at 5 p.m. So that's on June 1st, Thursday, June
Michelle,
1st.
mark your calendar.
June 1st, I got it.
So, it always drives me nuts when I hear people say, oh, progressives need to stop protesting in the streets and turn that into action. Well, it turns out that protesting isn't just about demonstrating, it's about your voice, and it feels very good to be there with other people and be reminded that you're not alone in some of these struggles. So for anyone who is in this area, please come join us to show that this is something that's important to you. Beyond that, the Trump administration is making this decision, but I do want to go back to the point that Mitch McConnell and 21 other Senate Republicans signed a letter urging him last week to make this decision to pull out of Paris. So Trump is making the decision, but Senate Republicans own it just as much. And people need to reach out to their senators and need to reach out to their representatives to ensure that as progressives, with all the power and energy in the space and all the opposition towards Trump right now, that climate change is not forgotten. Of course, healthcare is important. Of course, immigration is incredibly important. Criminal justice, all the issues that are suffering. But climate change is as well, and we need to make sure that it ranks in terms of our opposition to what's happening here in Washington, D.C.
Christy Goldfuss, former managing director, White House Council on Environmental Quality, now Vice President of Energy and Environmental Policy here at CAP. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
It was
Thank
really,
you.
really great.
Thank you.
Thinking Cap is produced by Sally Tucker. Music by Kyle Epstein and Jacob Buchanan. Graphics by Matt Ingram. For more, find us at Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, and at AmericanProgress.org, or wherever you want.